Hello, it's Dean Ryan here from bookmakers.com TV. I'm joined by Mark Fordham. Mark, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Dean. How are you?
Yeah, good. And we're going to have a quick ramble. Of course, it's Premier League time, and net spend is always a massive topic once a transfer window closes. And you've written a great piece on bookmakers.com, of course, all about the Premier League net spend league tables, if you want to call it, and how it affects, well, what the bookmakers think, and I guess what the fans think about where their teams are going to sit in this year's pecking order. We might start with last season before we talk about what's just happened in the summer window. Last season, Arsenal led the way under Mikel Arteta with the biggest spend in the season, not by too much. Newcastle were second in the table, Manchester United back in third, Crystal Palace, West Ham, everyone kind of middling around the 50, 30 million spend. There was some spending going on, but it was a difficult period for football clubs with uncertainty around given a global pandemic. But Arsenal kind of went for broke in that situation, and they spent big again this year. But it ended up with them finishing fifth in the table, Mark, which probably slightly, well, maybe actually that met Mikel Arteta's expectations. I don't think anyone pegged them for a guaranteed top four place.
No, I think that they as you said they went for broke with a new kind of way of recruiting players in kind of going for young players that will have high sale value, because they've had quite a few players in recent times who have left for no money. Like you look at Aubameyang, who was allowed to go for free to
Mm,
Barcelona, and who has since been bought by Chelsea in this window for
mm,
actual money, but no one was willing to give Arsenal any money.
mm.
So that obviously plays a part in the net spend anyway. But I think that if you were an Arsenal fan coming into, after three games last season, having lost all of them, they were to, if you were to be given fifth, which was three places better than they finished the season before, like they'd have probably taken it. But
Yep.
then you obviously look at the last month of the season, and it then becomes kind of a bit of a failure. And you look at it, they spent 100, they were 100 over 120 million in the red,
Mm.
and it kind of then makes it look like they should have done better, perhaps. But then I think they kind of, moving into this season, they sort of almost doubled down on Arteta and the way that they're trying to build the squad. And while they were superseded by some other spending this year, because there isn't quite so much uncertainty in the markets for at least Premier League clubs, not
Yeah, for
necessarily
sure.
elsewhere in the world.
Yep.
And they, I think they now have more of a glimmer of hope for fourth than perhaps at the start of last season.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I mean, if you consider the last season's net spend league table, and of course in that article on bookmakers.com, the teams at the top of the table, of course, the winners were Manchester City. They were middle of the road in the spending table, only managed to spend 30 plus million. Chelsea finishing third, basically almost had a net zero spend, which is interesting in its own right. Liverpool spent okay money, somewhere again around mid-table, around with Man City. But I think what we're seeing there, Mark, and it kind of is elaborated on in your piece, is that these totals amalgamate, don't they? It's not what you do in one window; it can be what you do over several windows, and then you don't need to be the big spenders this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. So you see Man City, they are routinely now in the last few years, it they're kind of nowhere near the top 10 usually for net spend, but that's because they have for a lot of years to get to that level spent, enormous sums of money. And now you're seeing teams such as, West Ham, they were in top six last year for net spend. This
Mm,
year they're in the top five, and that's all trying to chase that elusive fourth spot because of how much extra revenue that builds. And you see with Chelsea, the way that they kind of lost players towards the end of last season and lost their way a little bit, and now they have their new shiny new owners who have lots of money to spend. They're trying to prove that they can stay where they think they belong. And other teams, for instance, you look at Leicester now, where they have spent quite consistently for a few years, and they've punched above their weight really, and now they have had an off season where they haven't been able to spend really at all,
mm.
and they're not now able to stay in the same level that they were previously.
Yep, and we're seeing a couple of teams like it was very well documented that like Everton had to sell this year before they could even do anything, and that's common with the financial fair play rules, and that once you overstep the mark a few times in a row in chasing those vaulted league positions and the money that brings, that there is always a fallback unless you get there. And if you don't get there, a couple of your players have to move on at some point.
Yeah, and I think that it's not a punishment as I think it was originally meant to be, the financial fair play. But
Mm,
as you say, you've seen teams this summer wary of that. Even Arsenal, strangely, when they've spent well over 200 million in the red for the last 2 seasons,
mm,
they were more wary towards the end of the transfer window of spending that extra money, because they might be then a lot tighter both to UEFA's financial fair play rules and Premier League's financial fair play rules,
yeah.
um, and what that punishment would then entail afterwards. And it's a huge gamble, and I mean, I don't think there's a team that's made any more gamble this summer than Nottingham Forest with
Mm,
trying to stay in the league. It shows how much money there is available to clubs that are coming up and how valuable it is to stay in the league with the amount of money they've spent. I mean, the number of players is, that's another debate for another day. But the amount of money they've spent is clear. They are putting all their chips into staying in the league.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they're a fascinating outlier of the current net spend league table, which of course is in that article on bookmakers.com. I mean, let's talk about them. We'll get to Forest. I mean, Manchester United under Eric Ten Hag now have gone big, and in the very towards the end of the window, once Ten Hag had assessed his squad, they've gone really big. So they top the table only by a couple of million over Chelsea, who obviously have new owners and they're looking to make a statement. But there's a big gap from the top two, Manchester United and Chelsea, with well over 200 million. In the red, as we call it, with West Ham, Forest, and Newcastle, and the likes of Spurs and Arsenal behind them. But there's a big gap. Those two names that, and we're not associating with league challenges anymore because of the City and Liverpool domination. They're really trying to get back there, though, aren't they?
Yeah, I think Manchester United, the thing for them is they obviously dominated the Premier League for the first 20 years of its
Mm,
existence.
mm,
And I think that the fans have yearned for that for their years of, for want of a better phrase, suffering, because there's a suffering in relative terms compared to a lot of other clubs in recent years. But they are desperate to get back to where they were, and I suppose I'm slightly surprised that they have spent quite as much as they did, because kind of all the sounds that were coming out of United in the summer was that this is a rebuild job for Ten Hag. He doesn't necessarily have to get Champions League this season, but you would think that the money that they have spent, they'd be pretty disappointed if they then don't make the Champions League. And if you look at the current odds, they're certainly, I think they're outsiders for reaching top four.
yeah. Yeah, the bookmakers seem to think so. I mean, they're definitely an outsider for a league challenge, that's for sure. And that might take another season or two under Ten Hag. But even top four, for them not to be in the kind of odds on category to reach that spot shows you just how much work there is to do there. But they can't back the manager anymore, really. And at the end of a window, when prices have vaulted, and they've given a lot of money to his former club, Ajax, they've gone for proven players that he knows and knows well. I think if they don't get top four, regardless of what the bookmaker suggests, there will be disappointment again at Manchester United.
Yeah, I think there will definitely be disappointment, and I think it's a good kind of litmus test for, if you bring a manager in and you trust him to use the players that he trusts. So he's spent big on three players coming in from the Netherlands,
Mm.
and that has in the past been a tricky transition for some players, and how quickly they can then adapt it will be a big thing for United. I mean, you saw in the first couple of games this season, I think teams really targeted Lisandro Martinez,
Mm.
but I think that his partnership with Varane has helped out United in the last few games. How long that can continue is another thing, because a lot of people have put quite a bit into Martinez's stature as a centre half, and how physical the Premier League is compared to the Eredivisie.
Mm.
And then Anthony, obviously, he started really well this past
Mm.
weekend just gone. But it's just 60 minutes, and it's going to be it's I think the months leading up to the World Cup, as to where United are before we have the winter break. I think it's going to be really telling, as to kind of the real feel at the club.
Yeah. I think it's a chalice that maybe could be poison for Ten Hag to get all that money early, to make those changes early. I'm sure you recall when Pep Guardiola went into Man City and immediately focused on the goalkeeper. Joe Hart had been a mainstay at Man City between the sticks, was suddenly replaced with a ball playing keeper, and they've stuck to that mold. They changed the way that side played. And with Ten Hag, I think, the Maguire situation is similar. He was a mainstay there, well, obviously England's main centre half, a captain of the side, and the figurehead at Man United, even though while it was going wrong, and for him to be dispatched for a ball playing centre half, I might call him, and one with certainly different characteristics, is a big statement. So it would be interesting to see what they do. And you make the right point about what will happen in that winter window, and they may have to go again in January if it's looking like a title challenge is possible. I think they will. If it's looking like top four is consolidated, maybe they'll relax. Interesting point. Chelsea, it's almost a bit of Football Manager going on there, where names that you recognise are names that they are bidding for, and they've been very busy. So we all thought maybe in a post Abramovich era it might slow down. It didn't do that.
No, and I think when the new owner was, or the figurehead of the ownership group was the LA Dodgers CEO, he is the LA Dodgers have been known to be the top of the payroll in the Major League Baseball for the last few years, and they're going their way to winning World Series. And I think that I think you're right to suggest that it's almost like Football Manager, because it's you see kind of in the last couple of weeks of the transfer window, you saw that with Chelsea, that someone would be linked with bidding for a player or have bid for a player, and then a few hours later Chelsea are doing that also.
Yeah.
But it also didn't necessarily work. So they had 4 or 5 players that they wanted to sign and were willing to, you look at Rafinha, you look at Frankie de Jong, and they never quite got over the line. Whether that is because players aren't quite sure that Chelsea are the team they were, and that they can stay at the level that they have been previously is another thing. And if that is the case, the early signs for this season would suggest that those players are slightly vindicated. Whether Aubameyang can provide the goals that they need at his age, and I suppose the way that his career ended at Arsenal, whether that was a harbinger for what he is in the Premier League now, or whether that he is what they need as a focal point. I mean, he's very, very different to what they did have last season, who Thomas Tuchel clearly didn't like in Romelu Lukaku.
Yeah.
So if he can't score the goals, I struggle to see how their investments are going to prove worthwhile in terms of trophies.
Yeah. Fascinating time for those two teams, because they want to be back in the title race. They've done the business that should at least get them back into the talking about title challenges, but we'll have to see whether it comes. West Ham spent plenty of money now for David Moyes. Almost like at the end of the window, they realised they were going to be short. They reminded themselves that there were 5 substitutes available and their squad is a bit light, and they've done plenty of business. It could take a little while for them to bed in, but I mean, they are outliers in the top 4 race. They're certainly not going to be involved in any kind of title challenge. Pressure on Moyes with that kind of spend, another 150 million. I think you said they were in the top 4 or 5 teams spending the season before. They did get a good run in Europe, but is that enough?
I think a lot will depend on what happens in the next 6 weeks or so, because the season hasn't started how they would want for the amount of money that has been spent. And yes, I think ultimately they are probably aiming for that 5th spot. I think that 4th, I don't know whether that's necessarily a realistic goal for them, with the way that kind of the end of the last couple of seasons has gone for them. But if they don't continue to go the way that they had done in the last couple of seasons under Moyes, I think that he could come under real pressure if they sit and languish in 12th, 13th spot. That's not what 150 million net spend is going to be too good for the West Ham owners.
Yeah, I think their get out of jail card is Declan Rice. At some point, they need to correct the books. They can obviously sell one man and balance it all in one go. So probably make or break for him at West Ham this season, to see whether he does a Calvin Phillips and heads for pastures new on the basis that his current club can't get him to where he'd like to be playing his football. You mentioned Forest before. Let's talk about them. This is the ultimate gamble, isn't it? Do we stay in the Premier League? Do we literally change their whole squad? And plenty of them enforced because they were very much a loan-based team to get into the Premier League. But my word, I mean, they've given Cooper everything. If you name a player, they managed to get him through the door pretty much.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting test case, and it's actually relatively similar to the way that Fulham were 3 or 4 seasons ago, where they failed to stay up and they kind of almost signed everyone under the sun. They didn't sign 21 players like
Mm,
Nottingham Forest have, and I suppose the question for some of the players that have signed, because they've signed, almost two teams. So these players, the players that signed at the start of the window, thinking they're going to be starting, now to find out that actually no, you're going to be a squad player at best for a team that is probably going to be bottom half of the table at least.
yeah.
It's an interesting test case for how Steve Cooper can keep them all happy, and if he doesn't get any results in the next month, whether he can keep hold of his job.
Yeah, it's a massive test. I mean, does 139 million net spend buy you 44 points and keep you in the Premier League? We're going to find out in the coming months. It is a fascinating test case as you make because there will be teams coming up from the Championship next season staring at the money that they're about to get and going, do we put it all in the squad? And this will be the litmus test to see whether that is the case. Newcastle warming up, of course, 122 million spent this time. They were big spenders last window, but that was all about staying in the Premier League. This year, it's got to be about pushing top 8, top 6, maybe dallying with Europe. And they're giving Eddie Howe enough tools probably to have a go.
Yeah, and I think the way that they played against City earlier in the season at
Mm,
home, like they were two up against them, and they gave City a real fright when they played, and they probably deserved a point at Liverpool. They got a bit unlucky with the goal at the end, and I think you saw the way they played towards the end of last season as well. That Eddie Howe has got them playing in a pretty decent brand of football that I think will get them quite a few points. Whether it'll be enough to kind of overtake some teams that traditionally will finish in your sixth and your sevenths is another thing, and I suppose they're competing with teams like Brighton, who at the moment have started brilliantly. And if you look at the net spend table, they're bottom of the table, and they've made the most money out of anyone
yeah,
this window. 60 million they've made, and they play some excellent football under Graham Potter. Now, if Brighton were to finish above Newcastle, would that then class as a failure for Newcastle this season, given their newfound riches and that come with that their newfound expectations?
Mm. I mean, Brighton are susceptible to big bids from big clubs, whereas Newcastle now can just laugh any bid off for any player and leave it all up to the manager and the people in charge of that club to go, oh, do you want the money reinvest or do we just want to keep the player? And they can bat off all these suitors for their players. So big season for Eddie Howe, and there's more money there to spend when they need to go again. So it'll be fascinating where they end up. And then finally, I guess the only two teams to talk about in this season's net spend. Both hail from North London. Tottenham slightly outspent, I say slightly, 20 million or so outspending Arsenal. And there was a lot of noise made about Tottenham investing 150 million capital injection into the club and going to go and spend it all in the window. They didn't even get it all spent. And there is a feeling now with Spurs fans that Conte maybe isn't just in it for a quick fix. Their longer haul might be in his plans. And I thought their spending towards the end of the window when there was a few opportunities to do business and maybe signaled that.
I I think for Spurs fans that would have to be the hope,
Mm,
because I think history has told us that if Conte wants a player and doesn't get a player, he can quite easily become disgruntled.
yeah.
So I think the hope among Spurs fans would be that isn't the case, and that he was kind of being more judicious than perhaps than it might seem. But I think that some of that may be because they spent a decent amount of money in January and spent well in January.
Yeah.
And so I think that perhaps with the way that Spurs finished the season last season, the thought may be that they only needed a few additions to, if nothing else, to stay in the top four. And maybe potentially stay on the periphery of a title challenge for most of the season, I think.
Yeah, I think you summed that up perfectly. I think they need to be in the discussion point of a title challenge until it's almost acceptable to not be in it anymore when City have run away or Liverpool have hit peak form and no one can maintain that race. And I think that's essential for Spurs fans to see that progression, and probably essential for Conte to see that kind of progression. And top four would be the bare minimum for them, for sure, given another spending window, January in play, and Conte, well, we don't know what the shelf life is like. So I think that is the minimum for sure. And keeping hold of their best players will be essential there. Pressure always comes upon the likes of the Kane and the Son and people like that to move on if trophies are not incoming, and they haven't been. Now we'll talk about Arsenal finally. I think is the last one in there, because once you dip below Arsenal, who are around the 100 million spend mark, it's into the consolidation spending where teams have just replaced the player who's left, and they're all looking really to stay where they are. I don't have great any ambitions, but Arsenal this season, top four for Arteta, given how close they got last year, it has to be the aim.
Yeah, I think it would be a real failure for the club if they weren't to make top four. I know that noises out of the club will suggest that as long as they see progress, then top four isn't necessarily the problem. But you've seen Josh Kroenke say previously that Arsenal were a Europa League club on a Champions League wage bill, and they've spent a lot of time on reducing that wage bill. But now with this injection of players in the last couple of transfer windows, couple of seasons, I think that fourth has to be their minimum. I do think they've spent really well for what the side needed. Whether they've spent enough in terms of numbers and squad depth is, I think, another thing. Like leading up to the World Cup, the fix, particularly now with the Europa League, which they didn't have last year, they could pretty much pick the same 11 whenever they wanted. Now with fixtures coming thick and fast, whether they have the squad depth available to them is, I think, it's going to be really telling. And then, if they're still in the top four shout come the winter break, are they then going to reinvest again in January, or are they going to trust that this is the group of players they wanted? Because I think ultimately last January, what made them lose out on top four is that they didn't invest in potentially the squad depth that they needed. And so while they've spent a lot of money, they haven't brought a huge number of bodies in, which could impact their chances come the end of the season.
Yeah, a whole new challenge for Arteta, really, to mix that European football with league ambitions this term. And it's kind of an advantage that Newcastle have over everyone else, where they can spend the money, resist selling their best players, pick the same 11 every week, not have to be concerned about what goes on midweek. Maybe they can even have a run at the Cups. I think they have that Arsenal edge this time round. And they're the fly in the ointment probably for a heap of clubs that we've just talked about, all chasing that Champions League spot. Just historically, I mean, it's interesting in your piece on bookmakers.com about whether, net spend does buy you the Premier League. Manchester City, Mark, done it a couple of times, 2013 and 14 and 2017-18, where they spent the most and won the league. But that consolidation of spending means that they're still in the mix all the time. It's not going to happen this time round, we don't think, with Man United managing to land a title with net spend. But if they go and do that next year, they're probably going to figure again.
You would think so, because as you say, City haven't for the last few years been anywhere near the top of net transfer spend, and they win an awful lot of trophies. But that is because they have spent a lot of money in the past, and it's just about continuing that on, like regenerating the older players. So, for instance, Fernandinho goes this summer, and they replace him with Calvin Phillips. They have the money, the wherewithal to be able to do that every season. And I suppose that's kind of what every club wants to be able to get to. I think that Liverpool are slightly different in that, when they won the title, they were 18th in transfer net spend, and some of that is because they had built up a very good squad. But you kind of saw a little bit of frustration, I think, this summer in the lack of recruitment, certainly in the midfield, and they have played some incredible football over the last few years and have been among the best teams in Europe. And whether they are kind of paying the price of trying to then compete with City for a few years and not being able to, in financial terms, whether that is then going to come back to bite them, and they're going to kind of draw back towards the chasing pack. And then you see your Manchester Uniteds and your Chelseas, if they continue to spend their 200 million every year, that at some point as long as you're spending smartly, like at some point that will have to show up on the league table.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. I mean, the piece is fascinating. Of course, we've just reached the end of the transfer window, so all the stats and data are there on bookmakers.com. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Mark. I think the most interesting thing I'm looking to see what happens this season, apart from biased loyalties towards the teams that we both support, would be, does it work for Forest? Has what they've done in the transfer window set the bar for what we're going to see from future promotion clubs? Because I think it is fascinating. They are a real test case that we haven't quite seen in the past. You mentioned Fulham, but I think this is a slightly different um, stab at just remaining where you can be and seeing what happens. It would be great to see them do it, because a big club in the Premier League is exactly what you want. And as you've seen from their game so far at the City ground, that kind of atmosphere should be in the Premier League every week. So it's great to see. I think Leeds have done it, and we've got one of the bigger clubs back, and that they seem to be consolidating under Jesse Marsh. Maybe they need more players and things like that. But I think that's the test. That's the one I'm looking forward to the most, Mark. I do encourage everyone to go read the piece on bookmakers.com. But for now, thank you very much for joining us on bookmakers.com TV.
Thank you very much.